the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates. This is StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh Revi. Our guest today joins us from Florida, Cleo Paskal. She's an expert on the Indo-Pacific, and we're talking about Wang's visit, a blitz, in fact, to the Pacific Island countries. Hi, Cleo. Good to see you after a while. I believe I've caught you on a day where you're traveling, so thank you for giving us time again.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for taking on the topic. Thank you for the viewers for spending your valuable time with us. And it's just good to see you again. It's been too long.
And there's no one better than you. I think there were some comments that had come in even before the show, if I can find them quickly. Yeah, here's one from Meula. Cleo is one of the few to highlight the Pacific Islands and their importance. She was one of the first to talk about the CCP's influence in Solomon Islands over a year ago and even before that. So thanks from our viewer side as well. Just getting straight away into the meat of it, could you explain to us the dangers of this sweeping draft? What is it, a vision and a plan that Wang Yi took to the Pacific Island countries? I know you call it China's Pacific Island first island chain, or potential for that. But interesting, as you've been pointing out over the last few weeks, the president of FSM, the Federated States of Micronesia, David Panuelo, who described it as the single most game-changing proposed agreement in the Pacific in any of our lifetimes. Just explain to us what's going on, Cleo.
Sure. So there were two draft agreements that were leaked. One was a vision, as you mentioned, this sort of China, Beijing's vision for the region, which went into kind of in general terms, how China would like to see the relationship between China and these countries. And there are a lot of countries in the region, and it covers about 1/6 of the planet, how they'd like to see it develop. And if you read the document, it really looks almost like a 19th century British colonial plan for the region. And then that document is supported by a second document, this 5-year plan document, which talks about the specific things that China would like to accomplish in the region over the next 5 years to get it closer to accomplishing that vision. And it is quite detailed, to the point of saying Xinjiang will give 20 scholarships, Guangdong will do this. We'll set up a specific envoy for the Pacific Islands. But in terms of the larger lines, what you can see is they're targeting things like using humanitarian assistance and disaster response as an excuse to preposition supplies. They're looking at harmonizing the telecom systems, which would mean essentially gaining control, which is what was in the President Panuelo letter. He knows what he's looking at. And what he's looking at is China's taking control of telecoms, taking control of sea space, trying to get control over the economies. It is quite comprehensive, and full credit to President Panuelo of the Federated States of Micronesia. He is from a country that recognizes China, and this is going to put him on China's political warfare target list, and he knows it. But he is so concerned about what it means for his country and for the region that he sent this letter to other Pacific Island leaders detailing what his analysis was about this vision and why it was such a problem.
Sure. You mentioned it looked like a British colonial plan. Now, I mean, this has been going on for years and decades. But I'm just going to pull out another map that you used in one of your recent articles. And if you can explain it a little further, the map and the whole idea behind it, because it's absolutely fascinating.
Okay, so the map, so I did a very rough map that showed my kind of Pac-Man level skills of graphic design. And then Pavak Patel, who's based in India, did this much, much better map. So again, credit to him for helping me create kind of a much clearer way of looking at it. The thing about the Pacific Island countries is that because of the Convention of the Law of the Sea, if you have one island, you get a 200 nautical mile economic zone, up to a 200 nautical mile economic zone around your island. So a lot of these countries have very small populations. Kiribati, which is split into 3 parts because of the way its islands are distributed in chains, only has a population. The entire population of this independent country is 120,000 people, but it covers as much of the planet as India. So the 3 dots that aren't attached to anything else, that's Kiribati, and it comes right up very close in Pacific terms to Hawaii. And these were locations of U.S. installations and Allied installations during World War II, where the U.S. had to push back Japan island by island. It was called the Island Hopping Campaign. And a lot of these locations, these old abandoned U.S. military locations, are now being looked at by China for redevelopment. And so when you look at the exclusive economic zone map of these countries, these are the 8 countries that Wang Yi is visiting on this trip. Wang Yi will be and his quite large delegation will be physically touching down in these 8 countries. These are their exclusive economic zones. If he manages to deepen relations to the point where, for example, his dual-use fishing fleet and his humanitarian assistance and disaster response prepositioning gets put in place, and they gain control of the telecoms, those sorts of things, then you see a situation where this band comes into play that has the potential to interdict Australia and New Zealand. Now, they don't need to use it to invade Australia and New Zealand. They just need to be able to use it to keep them off the strategic chessboard in case of something like an invasion of Taiwan. And President Panuelo's letter was very clear from his perspective, and his country is just straight north of, it's not red because there is no visit from Wang Yi to Micronesia, but his country is just north of Papua New Guinea. So it's not colored red, but you can see if you're trying to take Taiwan, your zone of defense doesn't start from the Chinese coast. It starts from Taiwan. You draw a circle around it and you start hitting a lot of these locations: Palau, Micronesia, Guam, Japan. So China needs to secure that whole zone if it's going to be able to take Taiwan. And what helps it secure that zone is block off anything that might come up from Australia that might be helpful for the defense of Taiwan, block off Hawaii, obviously block off India, which is why there's a tiny little red dot that you can see there, which is Timor-Leste, which is surrounded by Indonesia, which could be a very useful point for trying to interdict anything coming out of the Indian Ocean into the Pacific Ocean. So this map is a map of desired control. Whether China will achieve it or not is another thing, but of desired control over the strategic zone of the Central Pacific, the Southern Pacific, and leading into the Indian Ocean.
You just answered Jaideep Galavi's question in great depth there. Just looking at what's been happening on Wang Yi's trip, which is, of course, continuing, those pacts, they weren't agreed to at the foreign ministers' meet in Fiji. China's ambassador, I think, to Fiji said that there were specific concerns about the proposals, and Beijing is trying to build a consensus. Much of the mainstream media that is reporting from the region is calling it a setback for China, that the plan has been shelved, etc. But explain to us why you feel this is a Chinese learning curve, or they are recalibrating their plans. It's a long game, as you put it to me when we were chatting offline.
Yeah, so it's very useful to go back to some of those initial Chinese texts, like Mao's On Protracted War. You know, they see this as a protracted war. And this trip has not been a failure at all. I mean, just to give quite a few agreements were signed. These documents were leaked, so we know that was in play. But had it not been leaked, and we just saw the agreements that were already signed around things even like agriculture. Agriculture allows China to come right into the economy, onto the ground, to bring in equipment, to potentially do beneficial things for the population, but it gets them into the land system, which is incredibly important across this region. But even more important, I would say, is how the governments of the 8 countries that he visited reacted to the trip. First of all, a lot of these countries are still under quarantine. So a place like Kiribati has had no high-level delegations come through, very few, because they're quarantining everybody because of COVID. Wang Yi and his enormous team waltz right in. The government rewrote the rules for the Chinese, like they haven't for other countries, including, for example, India and the Solomons. The Solomon government, which welcomed Wang Yi with open arms, has been slow walking, if not stalling, the entry of the Indian High Commissioner to the Solomon Islands, not letting him come into the country. But they're opening it up for the Chinese. At the same time, they're restricting their own press and their own press coverage of these events, which is creating a lot of consternation among media across the Pacific. So only favored media is getting any access, if anybody is getting access at all. So you're starting to see this creeping in of a sinicization of these host countries, even just through the visit. And that is, through that, Wang Yi is gaining intelligence about which countries and which people within which countries are compliant. They're gaining intelligence about who's up against them. They may not have expected this response from Panuelo, for example. Now they know they have to target Panuelo. So it's giving them a whole set of new pieces of intelligence with which to calibrate as they move forward on this protracted war.
But the fact that these pacts or deals or vision documents, whatever you want to call them, were not agreed to at this meeting, does that show considerable pushback from the local regions, different, maybe not the elites in some countries, but some kind of pushback?
So I think that there has been some kind of a pushback. And in the same way that Wang Yi is using it to figure out who the opposition is, I think countries that care about a free and open Indo-Pacific can use it to figure out who they should be supporting in those systems. So we can also kind of gather information about who's brave enough to stand up to China. But I generally don't think that they thought that this would get signed. This was a discussion document. And the reason I don't is because there was a virtual meeting with foreign ministers, mostly virtual, that happened in Fiji in the middle of the visit. And if it was to be agreed, it probably would have been agreed there. And that doesn't, to me, make diplomatic logic. I would have thought that Wang Yi would have wanted to visit all of the countries individually first to address their concerns and talk to them about the documents before, at the end of the trip, trying to have some sort of signing session for the documents. To have the meeting in the middle either shows, great overconfidence, or I think that they thought this is an evolving situation and they'll adjust the document over time. These are very independent countries that we tend to call them all the Pacific Island countries. They're extremely different one from the other. They have embassies, and very large embassies in a lot of them. They know that. So I'm not so sure that they even thought that these documents would get signed, but they could, but were going to be discussed. So I don't like I said, there are setbacks, and they can gain intel from it, and we can gain intel from it, and the people of the Pacific Islands can look to other Pacific Island leaders that they want to work with as well on this. But it's far, far from game over or a big humiliation for China or anything like that. It's part of an evolving process that is evolving in the direction that Beijing wants it to evolve in. As we can see, by the way, the host countries have suppressed their own press, have waived quarantine requirements, have signed other agreements. There's a lot that's come out of this that's been positive for Beijing.
Just going to go back to one of the things you mentioned a little earlier about the Indian envoy who was not allowed to, or who's been told that there's nobody to meet him till July, I think, while Wang Yi is met at the drop of a hat. If you could, talk a little bit in terms of, it seems incredible that China would be worried about India in the South Pacific. I mean, why would it? And just to add to that, I'm just going to add one point from our viewer, Abhik Mahato, who says, could the recent developments in South Asia, Sri Lanka and Pakistan instability, and Nepal, Maldives, there's Sri Lanka, of course, tilting towards India, be driving China's push towards Oceania?
So those are two very complementary kind of questions. So I would look at it the other way, which is India's success at helping its neighbors repel some of the Chinese push in, say, Maldives, and we'll see what happens in Sri Lanka, I think is what gets China very worried about India coming in to the Pacific part of the Indo-Pacific. The only country, or the country that's been the most effective at fighting Chinese political warfare has been India. I mean, India's led the way on this in a way that we all have a lot to learn from. And I think the thing that woke a lot of people up was after the 20 Indian soldiers were ambushed and murdered in Galwan. Within 2 weeks, India had banned 59 Chinese apps. That showed a strategic depth of insight into how China operates on the political warfare front that taught us all something, both about how China operates, but also how you can effectively fight back. And in the same kind of quiet, targeted, effective way, India has been helping its partners within the Indian Ocean region to push back against Chinese political warfare, which of course softens up the ground for China's goal of winning without fighting, and if not, being in a position to win a kinetic war. So I think that's why China pushed its proxies, which is what we think happened in the Solomon Islands, to delay the entry of the Indian High Commissioner to the Solomon Islands, because India is really one of the few countries that can fight that political warfare ground game against China. And it's not that expensive and it's not that complicated. But India knows how to do it, and isn't the West. It isn't somebody coming from Washington giving them a lecture. It's a neighboring country who's gone through the same things, who's also developing, who has a lot of economic alternatives to offer, who has a lot of practical alternatives to offer in healthcare, education, that sort of thing, that can stymie that Chinese advance. So. I know a lot of Pacific Island leaders would like to engage more with India, learn from India, exchange information with India. I think what President Panuelo's letter said was the sort of thing you could read from an Indian leader about what's going on in the Indian Ocean. And the more that the two oceans come together in a free and open Indo-Pacific around these sorts of issues, the better off we'll all be.
What about the big powers? I mean, the U.S. has said it's reopening or re-engaging with the Solomon Islands, having a mission there. We saw Secretary of State Blinken earlier this year, I think in February, travel to the region. Kurt Campbell, the Indo-Pacific coordinator, is also there. And you had Wang versus Wang with the new Australian government as well. Put into context what Australia may have been doing wrong to let China slip in, so as to say.
So every country is a little bit different, but the starting point is, what is your vision for the region? And I think and we can see from a lot of the Australian documents, like for example their foreign policy white paper in 2017, and the same is true for New Zealand around things like the Pacer Plus trade deal, is they want to, and this is the term used in the white paper, integrate the security and economics of the Pacific Islands or into their systems. So that's not a great thing to hear if you're a Pacific Island leader, that that they want to integrate you, because the systems are very different. Things like land tenure are very different. Governance structures and styles are very different. But I think there's this kind of idea, and you can see it around the Solomons, that if you have a copy of the Australian system or the New Zealand system in the Pacific Islands, that then just kind of follows along that Western structure, then you've secured the region. And what happened in the Solomons was there was a civil war that ended with a peace treaty in the year 2000, Townsville Peace Agreement. And part of the problem was colonial boundaries. That the Solomons is made up of several hundred different islands, a lot of different cultures. And they had tried to put in place a centralized government. It wasn't working. They needed much more decentralization, much more along the lines of kind of an Indian federated model. And that was what was agreed in this peace agreement. And there was an Australian-led peacekeeping force that was in the Solomons subsequently for about 15, 16 years. But it's hard to have a peacekeeping force if you've got all of these different centers of power. And it was more convenient. I don't think it was malicious. I just think it was convenience to have a centralized governance structure within Honiara, the capital of the Solomons, for the peacekeeping troops to work with. And similarly, they wanted to sort of say, okay, you do this, you do this, you do this, and to have a kind of almost semi-compliant, centralized system in place. Now, that is exactly what the PRC thrives on. So when the Australian-led peacekeeping mission pulled out, you had a centralized, compliant with authoritarian tendencies systems in place that PRC could just walk straight into and pick up the reins that had been dropped by Australia. And so, what needs to happen is go in the Solomons, go back to the Townsville Peace Agreement, have this federated system, disaggregate power. It'll be much more difficult for China to take over if the people of the Solomons have much more power. So, the West has not been great at the things that are based on the common values of democracy, transparency, accountability, and rule of law. And if that was a priority, then it would make it much, much more difficult for China, because the people of the region will fight for their independence in a way nobody else will. There was a General Doolittle who ran the Doolittle raid almost 80 years ago, which was a retaliatory attack for the attack on Pearl Harbor. They flew their planes off the decks of ships off the coast of Japan, knowing they didn't have enough fuel to return to their ships. But they did it, and most of them survived. And he said that there's nothing stronger than the heart of a volunteer. And that is true. The people of the region, like President Panuelo, will fight for his country. He has volunteered to fight for his country in a way that can overwhelm any amount of Chinese money. So those people, those volunteers who are willing to go to the front line for their country in political warfare or kinetic warfare are the ones that need to be identified and supported, and ideally by India, who feels exactly the same way about the way China is moving throughout the region in order to extinguish those very same values.
So, I mean, like you pointed out, the Solomon Islands showed the region or the different countries there what a Chinese playbook could be. We saw what happened there, and you've written extensively about it, the capture of the political elite, corruption, etc. But as you went on earlier, when you were talking about what happened after the China Pacific foreign ministers meeting in Fiji, most of it virtual, as you pointed out, it's not over. Chinese ambitions are not over. Wang is in Kiribati and then Vanuatu.
I think he's in Tonga, or he's just left Tonga. Yeah.
Correct. So the ambitions are long-term.
Yeah, they are. And actually, I've been thinking this through, Amitabh, and I wonder what you think about this. So we use the term political warfare, which is a tactic, right? It's it's the three warfares: media warfare, psychological warfare, lawfare. And in fact, if you go back to the original book of unrestricted warfare written by the two colonels, PLA Air Force colonels, what you see is 24 different warfares. And I've been trying to think about, okay, how do you actually describe the effect? And I've been wondering whether one way to describe it is the actual goal, if you can't take over the country outright, is to create a state of entropy within the country. So entropy kind of meaning falling apart, a lack of action, disintegration within the country, this sort of entropic warfare. So create a situation like you see in the Solomons, where you bring back a civil war, because that would give a legitimacy to an authoritarian regime to bring in PLA troops to help quell dissent, which is what is in that signed security document between the Solomons and China. So I was wondering what you thought about that. You're very knowledgeable, and I learned a lot from your shows. So what do you think about this idea of kind of this entropic warfare, where one of the goals is basically, if you can't take over the country, create a state of entropy within the country so that you can take it over that way.
It seems to make a lot of sense, but are there any other examples that we can look at to
Sri
illustrate
Lanka?
that? Yeah, to an extent, where it goes now.
Well, that's it, because India's helping. India's helping to fight the entropy.
Well, since you're talking about India helping, I'm moving out of the South Pacific island chain here, but just a question from Abhik Mahato. Have the Philippines' recent elections made the South China Sea slightly friendlier for China from a military perspective? And here again, India has reached out, not just in terms of development into digital governance, Aadhaar models of getting direct benefit transfers to the people, but also the BrahMos missile system.
Yeah. So and again, this shows how important India is. Both in the Philippines and in Indonesia, those are two kind of pivotal countries. Looking at a map is really, really important. And when you look at the map and you see where the Philippines are, especially and Indonesia, and when you look at that linkage between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, you realize that what obviously Chinese strategists realized a long time ago, and World War II strategists realized before that, and the colonists, European colonists realized before that, these are really important places. And in the Philippines, similar to what you find in many other places like the Solomons, there's a big constituency that is not a fan of becoming a vassal state of China. But they don't necessarily have viable options. The U.S. didn't stand up for the Philippines and its South China Sea claims in the way that it really should have. So again, this is poor India. India's MEA is already overburdened, and you've already got a lot to do, and you are literally on the front line with China in a way that nobody else is. But your lessons around how to handle that and how to protect your economy are very important for many potential partners in the region. Of the Quad countries, India is the only one that can compete with China at the economic level. And the economic level is the primary entry point for China into a lot of these countries. The other three countries have developed Western economies, which are not necessarily suited in many sectors to compete with China in a place like the Philippines. So I don't know what's going to happen, but I hope that the people of the Philippines are given another viable option to just drifting into China's orbit.
Just taking some viewer comments on your earlier postulation of entropy. Okay. Jaideep Gadari says entropy is chaos to law of thermodynamics. Matara says exactly uncertainty, entropy, yay, Cleo, Sri Lanka, the example that you did bring up. But since you're talking about viable options, Wangi's visit came, a day after or even during the Quad Summit or the end of it. Any options, viable options for maybe not in particular the South Pacific chain of islands, but alternatives in terms of the IPAF or the maritime domain that the Quad is working on?
Sure. Hopefully. That Wang Yi visit, the timing was a real slap in the face, because it was just after the Quad meeting and also just after the Australian election. And it was a real, they could have been subtitled the "So what are you going to do about it" tour. It's like, okay, we're here. They're opening the doors for us. They're suppressing their press for us. They're signing deals with us. And what are you going to do about it? And what one thing the Australians did try to do is they sent their new foreign minister to Fiji. But even then, to reiterate, this is like saying, when you talk about the Pacific Islands, it's like saying Africa, or Europe, or whatever. These are very, very different countries with different priorities. They have complicated relationships with each other. And Fiji is not, if you're in the Northern Pacific, if you're in the Marshalls or FSM, traveling to Fiji can take 2-3 days of solid travel. This is not, and they don't like that all of the regional headquarters, like the Pacific Island Forum, are based in Fiji. And in fact, said, she was there addressing a Pacific Island Forum meeting, and 5 of the countries, the northern countries in the Micronesia, said just over a year ago they wanted to withdraw from the Pacific Island Forum because they didn't felt like they were properly represented there. So if she goes to the Pacific Island Forum and says, I'm listening to you, I really understand your issues, when 5 of the countries have said, we don't really like the forum, but Australia has been putting pressure on trying to keep them in the forum, it's not ideal. So hopefully that was a newbie mistake, and there's a bit of a learning curve there. But the way it came across, I think, to a lot of Pacific Island countries was, it's nice you showed up, but your language and things like the Pacific family don't really reflect our reality or our relationship with Australia.
So if you could take 2 quick questions from viewers. One is from Abhik Mahato. Does the US acknowledge its eroding influence among allies and partners in the face of hollow security assurances? And Mehul Lad, who says, what is Palau's role in all of this? Is there a ray of hope?
Yeah, so both very good questions. And so that first question is complicated because there are a lot of different United States. There's, Department of Defense, there's state, there's Department of Interior. I think within the strategic community, there's definitely an understanding that there's a problem, which is why Kurt Campbell led that delegation to the Solomons recently. And he did something that the Australians didn't do, which he made an effort to meet with the opposition leader, with the church leaders, with civil society as a whole. The Australians have been focusing very much on Sogavare, who's the prime minister, and Sogavare is very much in the pocket of China. So it alienated, to a large degree, the opposition. In fact, the opposition leader complained that the Australian police force that are in the Solomons are renting a beach house, allegedly, from a very corrupt politician linked to Sogavare. And the Australian response was to say, oh, you're lying and whatever. So they managed to not only have a bad relationship with the central government, but to humiliate or to attack the opposition who you should be working with. So the Americans haven't done that. The Americans have tried to work, in the case of the Solomons, with the opposition. The specific problem comes when you look up to the North Pacific and you look at the 3 countries, including Palau so well, which have compacts of free association with the U.S. These are very unique relationships. These 3 completely independent countries, own citizenship, all that stuff. Their defense through an agreement, through these compacts of free association, is taken care of by the U.S. The problem is that the financial components of those agreements are up for renewal in 2023 for Micronesia and Marshalls, and 2024 for Palau. And the negotiations have not been going quickly or easily, in spite of very strong bipartisan support by Congress. Congress has written about 6 letters to the administration saying, please sort this out. These are very small amounts of money. These relationships are very important to us. We want to maintain our good relationships with these 3 countries. They send more people to serve in the U.S. military than many U.S. states. They're old, deep friends. They've suffered a lot for American security. We want this resolved. And the administration did appoint an ambassador level person, Joseph Yoon, to move forward the negotiations. But just recently, letters have come out from the Marshall Islands finance minister to the Secretary of the Interior in the U.S. saying that there are big problems, alleging there are big problems with the management of the trust fund, and a follow-up letter saying that your response to our concerns has been such a problem that we may be at an impasse. This, of course, opens the door wide for these kind of entropic activities by China within the Marshalls because of discontent with the U.S. That could be a very, very big problem, not just for the people of the Marshalls, but also for U.S. strategic positioning in the region.
Cleo, Paskal, let me just put up a couple of comments to thank you both on behalf of StratNews and our viewers. 2.5 Front says, great discussion. And Illuminatus 2 says, holy crap, Cleo is mind-blowing. I love her analysis. Don't we all? That's why we got her. Thanks, Cleo.
Thank you very much. And it's good to see you again. Hopefully see you soon. In India.
Safe flights.
Thank you. Okay. Bye.
Bye. And thanks to all our viewers who've engaged a lot. I did try and take as many questions and comments as I could. We also putting up a UPI ID that has been requested by some of our supporters who can help us financially. That'll be up on the screen. The ID is also on the YouTube descriptor. And as soon as this stream ends, you can, of course, give us a thumbs up if you like this video. And right next to that, there'll be a heart-shaped icon that YouTube has just started, which is a super thanks if you are so inclined. This is The Gist on StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh Revi.